My name is Agatha, and at 73 years old, I thought I had experienced every possible form of heartbreak. I was wrong. The mahogany conference table stretched before me like a battlefield, surrounded by my 3 children, their spouses, and 2 grandchildren I barely knew. The lawyer's office smelled of leather and old money, the kind of place where families either come together or fall apart forever. Today, it would be the latter. As we proceed with the estate planning discussion, Attorney Morrison began, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Mrs. Patterson has expressed her desire to distribute her assets while she's still with us. I sat quietly in my chair, hands folded in my lap, watching my family's faces. For months, I had been preparing for this moment, knowing exactly how it would unfold. They saw me as a burden, a fading old woman clinging to a modest inheritance they felt entitled to. Leilani, my youngest at 45, shifted impatiently in her designer suit. She had always been the most vocal, the one who inherited her father's sharp tongue, but none of his work ethic. "Can we just get to the numbers, Mom? We all have places to be." Her older brothers, Marcus and David, nodded in agreement. Marcus checked his expensive watch while David scrolled through his phone. None of them had visited me in 6 months, except when they needed something. "Your mother's primary assets include this house valued at $350,000, her savings account with approximately $47,000, and her late husband's pension fund," Morrison continued. I watched their faces carefully. The disappointment was immediate and barely concealed. They had expected more, much more. For years, they had been circling like vultures, making comments about my comfortable lifestyle and wondering aloud about my investments. "That's it?" Leilani's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Mom, what about all those properties Dad used to talk about? The rental income he mentioned." I took a slow breath, feeling the familiar ache in my chest that came whenever my children revealed their true nature. "Your father often exaggerated, dear. This is what remains." The room erupted in whispered conversations. David leaned over to his wife, shaking his head. Marcus rubbed his forehead, clearly calculating whether the inheritance was worth the effort of maintaining any relationship with me. But it was Leilani who delivered the final blow. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Her face was flushed with anger and something else, disgust. "Are you serious right now? You're sitting here acting like this pathetic amount of money matters." She gestured wildly at the documents spread across the table. "Want money for what? You're on your last legs anyway." The silence that followed was deafening. Then one by one they began to laugh. Marcus first, a low chuckle that grew louder. David joined in, followed by his wife. Even my teenage grandson, my own blood, smirked and shook his head. I felt something die inside me in that moment. Not the quick death of sudden shock, but the slow, agonizing death of hope finally extinguished. These people, who I had loved unconditionally for decades, saw me as nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to their expectations. Attorney Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably, his face pale. "Perhaps we should take a short break." "No," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. "Let's finish this." The laughter gradually died down, but the cruel smiles remained. Leilani sat back down, looking pleased with herself, as if she had just put me in my rightful place. "As I was saying," I continued, reaching into my purse and pulling out a sealed envelope, "there are some additional documents that need to be reviewed." I placed the envelope on the table and smiled. a small, knowing smile that made Morrison raise his eyebrows. For the first time that day, I felt a spark of something other than pain. "What's that?" Marcus asked, eyeing the envelope suspiciously. "Just a little something I've been saving," I replied, my fingers trembling slightly as I touched the envelope's edge. "You see, children, sometimes the people you underestimate the most are the ones who surprise you." The room fell silent again, but this time the energy had shifted. I could see confusion replacing confidence on their faces. "You're on your last legs," I repeated Leilani's words slowly, tasting each syllable. "How interesting that you should phrase it that way." The envelope sat on the mahogany table like a ticking bomb. I watched my children stare at it, their earlier confidence evaporating with each passing second. After 40 years of careful planning, the moment had finally arrived. "Mom, what's in there?" David asked, his voice lacking its usual dismissive tone. I leaned back in my chair, studying their faces. How different they looked now, uncertain, almost childlike in their confusion. "Before I open this, I want to tell you a story about a young widow who was left alone with 3 small children and no money." Leilani rolled her eyes. "We've heard this sob story 1,000 times. "No," I interrupted firmly. "You've heard the version I wanted you to hear. The truth is quite different." I began to speak, my voice growing stronger with each word. "When your father died in that car accident, I was 28 years old with a mortgage, 3 children under 10, and exactly $237 in our checking account. The life insurance barely covered the funeral costs." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. They had never known these details, never bothered to ask about those early years when survival was my only focus. "I worked 3 jobs," I continued, "cleaning offices at night, serving lunch at the diner, and taking in sewing on weekends. You remember Mrs. Henderson next door watching you after school? I paid her with a little money I made hemming dresses for the church ladies." The room was completely silent now. Even Attorney Morrison had stopped shuffling papers. But I wasn't just working to survive. I was planning. Every extra dollar, every tip, every small amount I could save went toward one goal: making sure this family would never be poor again. I picked up the envelope, my fingers steady now. In 1984, I bought my first property, a small duplex 3 towns over, using money I had saved for 2 years. I registered it under the name AMP Holdings, my initials and your father's. You never questioned why I sometimes drove to other towns on weekends. You assumed I was visiting friends. David's face had gone pale. "You bought property? With what money?" "The money I earned while you slept soundly in your beds, while you played with your friends, while you grew up believing your mother was just a poor widow scraping by." My voice carried no bitterness, only truth. By 1990, I owned 3 properties. By 1995, 7. Today, I opened the envelope and spread the contents across the table. Property deeds, bank statements, business registration documents, 40 years of careful documentation. Today, I own 15 commercial properties across 3 counties, 7 apartment buildings, 4 retail spaces, 3 office complexes, and 1 small shopping plaza. I pointed to each document as I spoke. AMP Holdings generates approximately $43,000 per month in rental income. The silence was broken only by the sound of Leilani's sharp intake of breath. That's impossible," Marcus whispered, picking up one of the bank statements. "This shows a balance of $867,000. I finished for him. "That's just one account." There are 4 others. David grabbed another document, his hands shaking. This property. This is downtown in the business district. Do you know what this is worth? Approximately $2.4 million, I replied calmly. I had it appraised last month. The transformation in the room was immediate and complete. My children, who moments before had been laughing at my pathetic inheritance, now stared at documents that revealed a fortune they had never imagined. But why? Leilani's voice was barely audible. Why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us think that I was a burden? A poor old woman living on scraps? I gathered the documents into a neat pile because I wanted to see who you really were. I wanted to know if my children loved me or loved what they thought I could give them. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, his face red with embarrassment and something else, desperation. Mom, we had no idea. If we had known, you would have treated me differently, I finished. Yes, I'm sure you would have. But the question is, would it have been love or would it have been greed? I stood up slowly, my arthritis making the movement painful, but my dignity intact. These documents represent 40 years of sacrifice, planning, and hard work. 40 years of building something real, while you all assumed I was incapable of anything beyond baking cookies and writing birthday cards. Leilani reached for one of the property deeds, but I placed my hand over it. I think this meeting is over for today. Wait, David said desperately. We need to talk about this. We need to understand. What you need to understand, I said quietly, is that everything just changed. I placed all the documents back in the envelope and tucked it safely into my purse. You're on your last legs. I repeated Leilani's cruel words one more time. Perhaps, but these legs have carried me further than any of you ever imagined. 3 days passed before any of them contacted me. 3 days of blissful silence in my modest home, where I could finally breathe without the weight of their expectations crushing my chest. I spent those days tending to my garden, reading the books I never had time for, and making phone calls to people who actually mattered. When the doorbell rang on Thursday morning, I wasn't surprised to see all 3 of them standing on my porch. What did surprise me was how different they looked. Humbled, almost desperate. Gone were the confident smirks and dismissive glances. Mom, Marcus started, his voice carefully controlled. We need to talk. I stepped aside to let them in, noting how they looked around my living room with new eyes. The furniture they had always dismissed as outdated now seemed quaint rather than shabby. The family photos they had ignored for years suddenly drew their attention. I've made coffee, I said, settling into my favorite armchair, the one Leilani had suggested I replace with something more modern. Just last Christmas, they sat together on the couch, united for once, but not in the way I had always hoped. This unity was born of panic, not love. We've been doing some research, David began, pulling out a folder thick with printed papers, about AMP Holdings, about the properties you mentioned. I sipped my coffee and waited. The shopping plaza on Elm Street, Leilani said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. We drove by it yesterday. It's huge, Mom. The parking lot was full. There must be 20 businesses in there. 23, I corrected gently, including the Anchor grocery store that just renewed their lease for another 10 years. Marcus leaned forward, his businessman's instincts finally kicking in. The revenue from that single property must be substantial, I finished. Your father would have been proud. He always said location was everything in real estate. They exchanged glances, and I could practically see the calculations running through their heads, numbers they had never bothered to consider when they thought I was just their burden to bear. "But there's something else we need to discuss," I continued, setting down my coffee cup. "Something you discovered during your research that you haven't mentioned yet." David's face went white. "How did you know we found the investigation report? The one you commissioned from that private detective?" I smiled sadly. "Mr. Peterson called me yesterday. Professional courtesy," he said. "Apparently, he's been managing my property insurance for 6 years." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, Leilani spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We know about the conversations." My heart clenched, but I kept my expression neutral. "Which conversations?" "The ones we had last Christmas," Marcus said, unable to meet my eyes. About finding you a nice facility, about how it might be better for everyone if you put me in a nursing home," I finished matter-of-factly. "Yes, I heard that conversation. I was in the kitchen getting more coffee when you all decided my future." The pain in their faces was real now, but it was too late for the remorse I saw there. "We didn't mean it maliciously," David said desperately. "We thought you were struggling, that you needed help." "Help?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You thought I needed help managing my $43,000 a month in rental income?" Leilani started crying then. Real tears this time, not the manipulative ones she had used as a child. "We're sorry, Mom. We're so sorry. We had no idea. No idea that I was competent. No idea that I had spent 4 decades building something remarkable. Or no idea that I could hear you planning to warehouse me like an unwanted piece of furniture." I stood up and walked to my desk, pulling out another envelope, this one thicker than the first. "There's something else you need to know," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions in my chest. "About the special provisions I've made." Marcus straightened up. "Provisions? In my will, which was updated last week, there's what lawyers call a no-contest clause." I opened the envelope and showed them the first page of the document. It states that if any beneficiary challenges the will, files a lawsuit, or attempts to prove incompetency, they forfeit their entire inheritance. The color drained from all their faces simultaneously. "Furthermore," I continued, "if anyone attempts to have me declared incompetent or tries to force me into any care facility against my will, the entire estate gets donated to the Alzheimer's Research Foundation." "You can't be serious," Leilani whispered. "I'm deadly serious. And there's one more thing." I pulled out a final document. "This is a letter of instruction to my attorney. If anything happens to me under suspicious circumstances, if I die unexpectedly, or if I'm found to be suffering from any condition that would make me vulnerable to coercion, this letter provides specific instructions for a full investigation into my family's actions." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the same clock they had suggested I sell because it was too big for this small house. "Why?" Marcus asked finally. "Why are you doing this to us?" I looked at my 3 children, these adults I had raised and loved and sacrificed for, and felt a profound sadness settle over me. "I'm not doing anything to you," I said quietly. "I'm simply protecting myself from you." I walked to the front door and opened it. "I think this visit is over." They filed out slowly, their earlier desperation replaced by something darker. As Leilani passed me, she stopped. "This isn't over, Mom," she said, her voice carrying a threat I had never heard before. I met her eyes steadily. No, dear. It's just beginning. I disappeared on a Tuesday morning in March, leaving behind only a note on my kitchen table and a house that suddenly felt too small to contain all my secrets. The note was simple: gone traveling, don't look for me, Mother. What my children didn't know was that I had been planning this moment for months. Ever since I overheard that Christmas conversation about nursing homes and witnessed their true feelings about my worth. The private investigator they hired, the same Mr. Peterson who had unwittingly revealed their investigation to me, was now working exclusively for me. I had liquidated 3 of my smaller properties in February, converting them to cash through a series of quiet sales that didn't require my children's knowledge or approval. The money was safely transferred to accounts they had never known existed, in banks located in states they would never think to search. From my hotel room in Charleston, I watched the chaos unfold through a network of neighbors and old friends who kept me informed. Mrs. Kowalski next door called me daily with updates, her voice filled with the excitement of someone witnessing a real-life drama. "They're panicking, Agatha," she reported on day 3. "Leilani came by twice yesterday, demanding I tell her where you went." She was not very polite about it. I smiled, sipping my morning coffee while watching seagulls dance outside my oceanfront window. For the first time in decades, I woke up each day without the weight of their expectations, their criticism, their casual cruelty pressing down on my shoulders. "And the boys?" I asked. "Marcus hired some kind of professional search service. There are people calling all the hotels in the area, checking credit card records. David keeps driving by your house like you might magically reappear." The irony wasn't lost on me. They were spending more effort looking for me in 1 week than they had spent visiting me in the past 2 years. By the end of the first week, according to Mrs. Kowalski, they had discovered something that sent them into an even deeper panic. The properties. 3 of them were gone, sold to new owners who had no connection to AMP Holdings. "They went to Mr. Peterson's office," she reported breathlessly. "Leilani was screaming about fraud and theft. But apparently you have every legal right to sell your own property." Of course I did. The properties were mine, purchased with money I had earned, registered under a company I had created and managed for 40 years. But my children had apparently convinced themselves that they already owned everything simply by virtue of being my offspring. The second week brought more desperate measures. They contacted distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, old neighbors from previous addresses, even my former employers from jobs I had worked decades ago. They were systematic in their search, I had to give them that. Too bad they had never been systematic in their love. It was during the 3rd week that they made a discovery that changed everything. Mrs. Kowalski's call came earlier than usual that morning, her voice trembling with excitement and something else, concern. "Agatha, dear, they found something. Some kind of donation records." My hand tightened around the phone. "What kind of donation records?" I couldn't hear everything, but Leilani was crying. Real crying, not her usual dramatic tears. She kept saying something about cancer research and children's hospitals. I closed my eyes, knowing what they had discovered. During the past month, while they were busy planning my future in a nursing home, I had been busy making arrangements of my own. Significant donations to causes that mattered to me, organizations that actually helped people instead of just taking from them. "How much?" I asked quietly. I don't know exact numbers, but Marcus was shouting about millions, plural. That evening, my phone rang. Leilani's number appeared on the screen, and for the first time in 3 weeks I answered. Hello, dear. Mom? Her voice was raw, desperate. Mom, please, we need to talk. We found the donation records. Please tell me you didn't give away everything. I let the silence stretch between us, listening to her breathing, hearing the panic she was trying to control. Not everything, I said finally, but enough. How much is enough? She whispered. Enough to make sure that my money goes to people who will appreciate it. People who won't laugh at an old woman and tell her she's on her last legs. We're sorry. The words burst out of her like a dam breaking. We're so sorry, Mom. We were wrong. We were stupid. We were cruel. Please come home. Please let us make this right. Make what right, Leilani? Make me feel better about being treated like garbage by my own children? Make me forget that you were planning to throw me away like an old piece of furniture? We weren't. You were. And the sad thing is, if you had just loved me, really loved me, not my money, none of this would have happened. I could hear her crying now, deep sobs that might have moved me once upon a time. Where are you? She asked between tears. I'm somewhere where people treat me with respect, where they listen when I speak, where they don't assume I'm senile just because I'm 73. Are you coming back? I looked out at the ocean, at the endless horizon that seemed to promise so many possibilities I had never explored. I honestly don't know, I said, and for the first time in weeks, I was telling them the complete truth. The line went quiet, except for her continued weeping. There's going to be one more surprise, I said finally. Mr. Peterson will be contacting you next week with some final information. After that, you'll understand exactly what your choices have cost. I hung up before she could respond, then turned off my phone and walked out onto my balcony. Tomorrow they would learn about the last property sale, the biggest one of all. And then they would truly understand the magnitude of what they had thrown away. I returned home on a Thursday afternoon in late April, driving myself in a car they had never seen before, a practical sedan I had purchased with cash in Charleston. The azaleas were blooming in my front yard, their pink and white flowers a reminder that life continues its cycles regardless of human drama. Mrs. Kowalski spotted me first, rushing over before I had even turned off the engine. Agatha, thank goodness you're all right. They've been beside themselves. Leilani has been calling me every day, begging for any information. I smiled and hugged my faithful neighbor. I'm fine, dear. Better than fine, actually. They don't know you're back yet, she whispered conspiratorially. Should I call them? No need. They'll figure it out soon enough. I was right. Within 2 hours, all 3 of them were at my door. They must have been watching the house. Or perhaps they had someone else doing it for them. The desperation in their faces was immediate and overwhelming. Mom, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank God you're safe. I let them in, noting how they looked around the familiar space as if seeing it for the first time, which in many ways they were. Everything had changed, including me. Sit down, I said, settling into my chair. We have things to discuss. They perched on the edge of the couch like birds ready to take flight, their eyes never leaving my face. Mr. Peterson told us about the shopping plaza, David said quietly. About the sale. I nodded. My largest and most valuable property. The anchor tenant alone was paying $12,000 a month in rent. You sold it for $4.7 million, Leilani whispered, as if saying the number aloud made it more real. I did. To a very nice development company that plans to expand it. They were quite generous with their offer. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of lost possibilities. Where did the money go? Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would break his heart. I pulled out a folder from my desk. One final reveal in this long drama. $2 million went to the children's hospital where your father was treated during his final weeks. They're building a new wing for pediatric cancer research. Leilani made a small, wounded sound. $1 million went to the scholarship fund at the community college where I took night classes while you were young. It will help single mothers get an education. David put his head in his hands. The remaining money has been placed in trust funds for my grandchildren, but only accessible when they turn 30, and only if they maintain a relationship with me based on respect, not financial expectation. And us? Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. You? I leaned back in my chair, studying their faces. You get exactly what you valued me at during that lawyer's meeting. Nothing. The words hung in the air like a verdict. But there's something else you need to understand, I continued. Something more important than money. I stood up and walked to the mantelpiece, where I picked up a photograph of the four of us from many years ago, back when they still hugged me willingly, before they learned to see me as an obligation. For 40 years, I built an empire in secret. Not because I was ashamed of my success, but because I wanted to see who you really were. I wanted to know if my children would love me when they thought I was just a poor widow, or if they would only love what they could get from me. I turned to face them, and the pain in their eyes was almost unbearable. Almost. You failed that test spectacularly. All three of you. We can change, Leilani said desperately. We can be better. We understand now. You understand that I have money, I interrupted. That's not the same thing as understanding that I'm a human being worthy of respect. I walked back to my chair, feeling every one of my 73 years in my bones, but also feeling stronger than I had in decades. I'm not a vindictive person, I said quietly. I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing this to save what's left of my own dignity. Marcus leaned forward. What do you want from us? Tell us how to fix this. I looked at each of them in turn, these adults I had raised, loved, sacrificed for, and ultimately been betrayed by. I want you to leave, I said simply. I want you to go live your lives, and I want to live mine. Maybe someday, if you learn to see me as more than a disappointment or a source of income, we can try again, but not today. You can't be serious, David said. You're cutting us off completely? No, I replied. You cut yourselves off the moment you decided I was on my last legs and laughed about it. They sat there for a long moment, the reality of their situation finally sinking in. They had come home expecting to find a frightened old woman ready to forgive and forget. Instead, they found someone who had learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. There's one more thing, I said as they prepared to leave. I've decided to write a book about building a business empire while raising 3 children alone, about the secrets women keep to protect their families, about learning to value yourself when no one else will. Leilani's face went pale. You wouldn't. I would. And I will. Your names will be changed, of course. I'm not cruel, but the story needs to be told. They filed out slowly, their shoulders slumped with defeat. At the door, Leilani turned back one last time. Do you hate us? She asked, tears streaming down her face. I considered the question carefully. No, sweetheart. I don't hate you. I'm just finally done trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it freely. After they left, I sat in my garden as the sun set, listening to the birds and feeling truly peaceful for the first time in years. 2 years have passed since that final confrontation in my living room, and I can honestly say they have been the most fulfilling years of my adult life. I'm writing these words from my study in a charming cottage by the coast in North Carolina, where I moved 6 months after my children walked out of my house for the last time. The cottage isn't large, but it's mine in every sense of the word. I bought it with money I earned, decorated it with furniture I chose, and filled it with people who actually enjoy my company. My neighbor Eleanor and I have coffee every morning on my front porch, discussing books, politics, and the complex lives of the cardinals that nest in my oak tree. We never discuss money. The book I threatened to write became a reality. Building in Secret, A Widow's Guide to Financial Independence, was published last spring by a small press that specializes in women's stories. I changed all the names and locations as promised, but the story remains true. It's selling modestly, mostly to women my age who recognize themselves in my journey. More importantly, the book led to speaking engagements at women's groups and community colleges. I travel twice a month now, sharing my story with audiences of women who thought it was too late to start over, too late to build something of their own. The irony isn't lost on me. At 75, I'm finally getting the recognition for my business acumen that my own family never gave me. My remaining properties continue to generate income, though I've simplified the portfolio considerably. I kept the 3 most profitable buildings and sold the rest, using the proceeds to fund a scholarship program for single mothers at 5 different community colleges across the Southeast. The paperwork is handled by a management company now. I'm too old to be climbing around rental properties checking for leaky faucets. I stay in touch with my grandchildren through cards and letters. The older ones, now in their 20s, have reached out independently, curious about their grandmother who went missing for a while. I've met them for lunch a few times, carefully neutral meetings in public places where we can get to know each other without the weight of family drama. They're good kids, confused by their parents' anger, but beginning to ask their own questions about what really happened. The trust funds I established for them remain intact, gaining interest and waiting for their 30th birthdays. Whether they choose to have a relationship with me is entirely up to them, but their financial futures are secure regardless. As for my children, Marcus, David, and Leilani, I receive updates through the small-town network that connects all mothers, whether we want it or not. Marcus's business went through a rough patch last year. Apparently, he had been counting on inheritance money to expand. David moved his family to a smaller house, closer to his in-laws who help with childcare costs. Leilani took a job at a real estate office, which strikes me as appropriately ironic. They've tried to contact me a few times. Birthday cards with lengthy handwritten notes asking for forgiveness. A few phone calls to my old number that were forwarded to voicemail. One letter that found its way to my publisher, somehow reaching me despite my efforts to maintain privacy. I read Leilani's letter twice before filing it away. She wrote about understanding now, about seeing their mistakes, about wanting to rebuild our relationship. The words were beautiful and seemed sincere, but they came 2 years too late, and from someone who only understood my worth after discovering my wealth. Perhaps that makes me unforgiving. Perhaps a better mother would have opened her arms and welcomed them back. But I've learned the difference between forgiveness and self-destruction, and I choose to protect the peace I've worked so hard to achieve. This morning, as I water my tomato plants and watch the sunrise paint the ocean in shades of gold and pink, I think about the woman I was 2 years ago, sitting in that lawyer's office, listening to my daughter tell me I was on my last legs while everyone laughed. She was right about one thing. Those legs were indeed my last legs. My last legs as their doormat, their ATM, their convenient target for frustration and disappointment. But these legs, the ones carrying me through my cottage garden at 75, these legs are just getting started. I've learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the permission to walk away from people who don't value you, even when those people share your blood, especially when those people share your blood. The phone rings as I'm finishing my morning routine, and I glance at the caller ID before answering. It's Eleanor, probably wanting to discuss the book club selection for next month. Good morning. Dear, I say, settling into my favorite chair with my second cup of coffee. Agatha, you'll never guess what I just saw in the local paper, Eleanor says, her voice bubbling with excitement. I smile, ready for whatever small-town drama she's discovered. At 75, I've learned that the best stories aren't always the ones you plan to tell, but the ones you live when you finally give yourself permission to be free. And I am finally, completely free. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.